Hey there, SCP fans. My name is Grigori Karpin, and this is Simply Creative People, the show about SCP creatives, be they authors, artists, or offsite content creators like YouTube and TikTok. We're focused on bridging the gap between various fans and serving as an introduction to different concepts and stories on the wiki. So, many welcomes to all, and let's get started. Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of Simply Creative People. I'm Grigori Karpin, author on the SCP Wiki, and I'm joined by, as always now, I believe.
I challenge you to prove that I am not Harry Blank.
How do you prove a negative?
Exactly.
Yeah, can't do it. Just can't do it.
Can't be
Game
done.
over. Game over, liberals.
I win.
Today, we are going to be talking about the Daeva, which is a subject I know a little bit about.
Yes, these are the Daevas we know.
How long have you been waiting to use that one?
Oh, I've got like 5 or 6.
Good. Excellent. Perfect. So, we don't have a guest today, but, hopefully all of our listeners are here in spirit.
Yes, we'll just try to have larger personalities to fill the void.
That's right. We're going to have to actually interact with each other instead of just interacting with the guest.
Yes, I have plans to start at least 3 different fights.
What the even funnier secondary punchline would have been with who, though? Like starting fights with people that aren't here, and then we'll just see what happens.
Yes, well, my cat's in here somewhere. I could start a fight with the cat. Everyone loves cats.
Yeah.
And violence.
My girlfriend's in here now, but I'm not going to start a fight with her.
Oh, no, that's embarrassing. No, I won't be able to talk.
I have earphones in. She can't hear you. It's fine. She'll hear you when she listens to the podcast.
That's still kind of worrisome. The idea that there are people listening to this is scary. I prefer to imagine that this is just some weird role play we're doing.
Harry, you know I'm putting these out on the internet, right?
Define putting them out.
I post them on a distributor of podcasts, which then pushes them out to different podcast services for people to listen to.
Yeah, I just heard some weird hissing noise. I think my mental filter detected something that would hurt me and just wouldn't let me hear it.
Have you not listened to one of the episodes?
Are you kidding? I had to put up with them the first way through. Why would I do it again?
I do. I listen to them.
Yeah, I did too. Shut up.
Well, it's not just because I don't want to hear myself talk, but it's just to make sure the product is good or whatever.
I just listened to hear your half again.
Oh, so sweet.
Yeah.
All right. Well, like we've been doing, I thought we would talk a little bit about. I've been calling this Creative Corner. It's not a very creative title, but
irony.
I know. Every week we've been trying to discuss, aspects of our process, and we've been focusing on writing because that's what we do. But just, to give a little bit of insight into the way that people can get involved or advice, potentially, if they want to be involved. I've actually already gotten some decent feedback from people that says that it's been helping. So,
that's good. What was it? I haven't gotten any feedback. What did you get? What did you hear?
Just some people saying that our talks of, how to, process ideas, whether it be when GW was on, we were talking about refining ideas, or somebody had talked about our discussion with Mars about adapting things. I think a lot of people are very intimidated before they come and write for the wiki or for anything. In the grand scheme of things, writing for the wiki isn't that big a deal, but it certainly seemed like that before we started doing it. I'm sure it did for me.
Oh yeah, still does in a way, but yeah.
Yeah, that moment right before you post, oh god, is this shit?
It's like, come on, I'm on 111 pages now. At some point it needs to stop being worrying.
It's not as, I would say it has gotten a lot more tolerable. Yeah. I just kind of put it up now. I don't check it every 5 minutes anymore, which is really nice. I just tend to check it a couple hours later, but sometimes you still see, not enough people, come on.
I check the things I posted in 2020 every 5 minutes still, so.
Oh, well, I guess I technically do too, because I have a list pages thing on my author page, but I can't really keep track. Sometimes I'll look at my point totals or whatever you have, vote totals, and I'll be like, I went up, but I'm not sure which ones, because now there's so many, it's kind of hard to keep track.
It's always really weird when somebody starts reading your stuff during the day, and then you check your numbers, and somebody's giving you 20 new votes, and you have no idea where they came from.
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, we've both done things that are like series based, and when people actually read them as they're intended and give feedback along the way, it's fucking incredible. Like, I had somebody go through the whole series of Hakancheries not too long ago, and it was like, whoa, this is so nice.
It is. It's great when you get feedback, but when you get like serial feedback, it's heavenly.
Yeah, like, oh, I can chart the people's reaction to the storyline as it developed, and they can actually, they can look and see how I developed, not just the characters, but how the writing developed. It's good stuff.
It is.
So, in terms of creative corner, I thought this is a fairly nebulous topic because it just, came out of nowhere. It's been kind of a weird week. But I thought we could talk about finding our voice.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of people, when they first come to start writing for the wiki or for any medium, any genre, they feel fairly forced into matching their ideas or their concepts or their execution to the things that have come before.
Yeah.
And the best sign of someone kind of coming into their own in terms of writing or any creative activity would be that, that quote unquote finding your voice, which, if you're not in the creative business, we're not getting paid, but
are we ever not getting paid?
Yeah. That phrase if you're not aware, it's basically, what is the kind of story that you're comfortable telling? How do you tell it? And what is your slice of genre? Now, it doesn't have to be one thing, but it's there are lots of utility players out there that can do all sorts of things. Everyone's kind of got a tone and or a variety of tones that they are the most comfortable with. And I thought we could talk about how, in my opinion, and this is from the outside, I'm sure you'll disagree, but when you came on, I feel like you had that already. I don't think I did. Because it had been years since I had written fiction, 15 years or something before I had previously tried to create stories before I started writing for the wiki. But, from significant others on, I feel like, your storyline is developed, but I feel like you've known what kind of stories you like to tell.
Yeah, for me, the question of finding voice was finding out whether I was allowed to use mine. As opposed to figuring out what it was, because you do get that impression when you start out and you're brand new and maybe you haven't read enough of the weirder stuff on the wiki, and you start thinking, I need to write exactly like everybody else. And the fact that the SCPs are written in clinical tone means that you are sort of funneled into writing that part of what you're writing like everybody else, because that's the idea. It's a database. It's supposed to have a certain uniformity to it. But I gradually had to convince myself that I was allowed to write the kinds of stories and write the kinds of characters that I felt like writing, because it doesn't always feel that way when you look at the wiki as a monolith. And not too long ago, I looked at the original source of my first draft of my first SCP, and I see my characters in there. My first SCP, as it is on the wiki, hasn't got a lot of characters in it. It's got the main character who's being haunted by this monster, and it's got some mention of some doctors. But they haven't got a lot of personality, and I'm reading this original version, and the two doctors are commenting on each other's work, and one of them calls the other one a complete fucking hack, and I'm like, that's funny, because I had to cut that because I knew that people wouldn't put up with it from a brand new author, but this is exactly something I would write right now and post, and everybody would be fine with it. Because people get used to the idea that an author can write a certain kind of way. They'll get used to going, oh, this is him. He writes this way. He's fine writing that way. I'll accept it. But some brand new person with no karma on their Wikidot profile posting on the wiki with their first article, who writes a bunch of doctors who are shitposting at each other, they're going to downvote the hell out of that, because brand new people are sometimes not allowed to have voice by the first bunch of people who see their articles, which is depressing. I mean, you could trust the author long enough to read through the article and see if it's good. But I was I wanted to put the anomaly classification system, ACS, the big colorful bars at the top of my first article, and I didn't, because I was afraid, justifiably, that people would downvote it when they saw it, because some people, we'll call them people, downvote just based on tiny little theme things. And I was afraid to do that too. And I was afraid of all kinds of things, because I was worried they wouldn't accept my writing and my tone the way I wanted to do it, and I had to earn the right to do that, and that's depressing. But over time, I've been able to just insert my my ridiculous, over-the-top, often comedic and sarcastic crap in there, and people have learned to tolerate it from me.
Yeah, I mean, I will clarify a bit for people that haven't tried to write for the wiki. It's not so much that there is a rule.
No, not at all.
That new authors can't do things that are outside of the box. What Harry was referring to there is that, like, oftentimes if you're a name that no one recognizes, a lot of readers, and I'm not going to say it's a bad or a good thing, will be a bit more skeptical.
Yeah.
And I'm being very diplomatic by saying that. And have a tendency to reject new people that are trying something strange or that don't quote unquote fit the format. Whereas I genuinely think that the format is there as a limiting exercise, which is good for creativity, but the minute it starts hampering a story, toss it the fuck out.
Absolutely. That's absolutely the case. And yeah,
the risk is genuine, and you know, people's reaction, because there are lots of closed-minded people that are part of any audience. You always take a risk if you are being a bit more ambitious with your first thing, and so it is a common piece of advice for people to tell new writers, hey, you know, let's stay in your lane, you know, be a little bit less ambitious, get a few articles under your belt. I completely ignored that advice. But I also didn't do anything that was too sarcastic. Although, like, I remember people not complaining about, but kind of having feedback during the crit phase of my first article, and they were like, well, this gets, like, really cinematographic there at the end. It feels like a movie. And I'm like, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
That's what I was going for. I'm like, oh.
Yes.
And you know, and granted, I'm reading the tone into that, but it was there. The tone was there.
Yeah. We don't want to give anybody the impression that you can't just do that. I mean, if you are able to execute something wacky and cool, do it. But it is a risk-reward thing, especially if no one's ever heard of you before and you're showing up and going, I'm all up in your website and I'm not paying attention to anything you people have done before. Right. I had completely different formatting from what anybody was using because I had never bothered to look up any of the theme stuff, the CSS and all that. So I was using tables with colored headers for sections, and nobody does that. That's a thing I do. Although a few people have stolen it from me, stolen my limited my exercise in not knowing what I was doing, as though it was an aesthetic choice. And I had footnotes from various doctors commenting on the page, and people are like, "Well, you can't do that." And it's like, well, I did do that. Screw you.
And you know
it
what?
looked really different from everything else, and that made a few of the first people go, what the hell is this? And then once they realized I was never going to stop doing that, they just decided they might as well put up with it, which is where you need to get to when you want to be weird. It's just make sure everybody knows they can't fix you.
I mean, that's an inherent part of being creative in a public space, though, is sticking it out. And continuing to show through your product, through your stories or your music or whatever, that you have something to offer, and that the things that at first, when you're a no one, when you have no name recognition in this tiny pond that we swim in, you're not going to get as much leeway, so that's where the risk comes in. But the more articles you put out there, the more that people, recognize, oh, I read this such and such by this person, and that was pretty good. I'm just going to go with this. Yeah. And, I'm susceptible to it, too. If I see something that is... Actually, I'm not. I don't have any problem with anything that's risky. I have a problem with, like, the stuff that is so inherently the other direction. Like, it's so clearly a Series 1, but it's got... If 10% of the page is blacked out, I'm closing
checked out. Yeah, exactly.
I'm done. It didn't make sense back then. I know it was normal in Series 1, but it doesn't make sense back then. It sure as heck doesn't make sense now.
Yeah, I'm famous as a soft touch on what people want to do. Like, if you want to write something and not get me to downvote it, the trick is, it shouldn't be shit. It shouldn't be so incredibly archaic that half the page is blacked out, and it shouldn't be shouldn't contain deeply offensive sensibilities that are against human rights. And there shouldn't be like billions of spelling mistakes. Other than that, I'm generally either gonna go whatever or upvote something, because I'm more interested in seeing how people want to express their opinions and their stories and everything than I am. And if I'm reading something I don't like, I don't go, I don't like this, downvote. I go, I don't care about this, goodbye. And I'll just go read something else. But that's not how everybody works. So.
No, there's a bit of an edgelord aspect to writing on the wiki, and probably writing on the internet anywhere, where people are, kind of shoot from the hip critics. But that's okay.
That's a whole other conversation.
We've survived it, so it's fine.
Yeah.
But it is something you have to factor in while you do this other thing that we're talking about, which is finding your voice, because you've got to survive in that tiny pond while it's going and not feel discouraged. And the thing is that you just got to keep pushing for it. There are lots of people I know that started off writing, maybe not so much impressive stuff, that have stuck with it, that are now writing things that I stop everything to read. I'm not going to mention who those are because I don't want to insult them that their early stuff was something I didn't like. But, there are some people that show up right away and know how to write, and there are other people that don't. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that so many people come to the site without a lot of experience writing, which is cool, because this means that we are constantly growing a new generation of literate people in the wiki.
Yeah.
Even if sometimes I complain that people don't like to read. But the finding your voice thing means that you have to survive that process, meaning you have to flow with the is this a good idea for me to put this in or not.
Yeah, the thing is that reading and writing is a trust exercise. You have to trust that the readers will pick up on what's cool and unique in what you're doing if you've executed it right, but they also need to trust that you know what you're doing. So it isn't a terrible thing that people will look askance at you when you're brand new, because you are there to prove to them, I can play ball with this, I can fit something in here that will be interesting. But you also do want to prove to them that you have something to add. So when we say don't write the craziest absolute thing for your first article, go ahead and do that if you want to. Write whatever the hell strikes you as your first thing. But you do have to understand that the first few people who look at it, who have never even heard of you, have to be convinced that you know what you're doing, which means if you're going to write something crazy and off the wall, you need to have all your I's dotted and all your T's crossed, which I didn't. My first article was in danger of deletion for several days. It was one of the lowest rated pages on the wiki. I almost never wrote anything again for the wiki.
Oh my god.
Because I didn't have all of my stuff figured out. I had people love talking about object classes. They didn't like my object class. I had an absolutely execrable picture. It was completely terrible as the main picture. I still like it. It's charming. It's not good.
It is.
And there were a few other things that I didn't do correctly, and it's because of that they were less willing to tolerate my other eccentricities. So if you're gonna put yourself out there and do something crazy, which if it's in you to do, go ahead and do, make sure that you know exactly what you're doing on the basics. Whereas if you're gonna do something that's still crazy and interesting but not quite as outre, you might get a little more leeway. So make sure if you're going to completely put yourself out there that you know what you're doing. And if you don't know what you're doing, spend some time writing your first few things and learning what you're doing, and then save your really crazy ideas for when you know you can make them stick.
Right. And there's no shortcut, because you could learn by failing, and that's a good way to learn in lots of ways. But there's also a really good way to learn, which is absorbing the techniques of others. If you're in a hurry to write your first thing and you've only read a couple of dozen Series 1s, put a pause on that and read some more. Because,
not Series 1s.
Yeah, and again, we're not trying to bash on Series 1. I'm just trying to say that, you have to have your finger on the pulse. And Series 1 was 14 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, Series 1 can teach good Series 2 writers, but we don't want those.
Right.
Series 1 does not teach you to write something deep and nuanced, mostly.
Right.
I mean, Series 1 is 1,000 articles.
Yeah, and I mean, I haven't read them all, so
no,
I'm not
neither
trying
have
to say
I.
that they're
not all the same, but they're very different, in fact.
Yeah. And as a tangent, really knowing Series 1, if you also get to know what the modern sensibilities of an expectations, for a new writer would be, and you are able to rise to that occasion, but you're able to mimic or call attention to the earlier stuff in a subversive way, that can work really well. I think that there's a lot of good modern articles that do that.
Yeah, that's a popular writing technique. That's a thing that Grant Morrison, as a comics writer, does constantly.
Yeah.
He knows all this old shit, and he brings it back and respins it, and it works really well because it makes the world feel lived in, and it also gives a sense of continuity to what you're doing, which is part of what having a creative writing project with the community is for.
Right. Well, Grant Morrison is a mad genius. So.
Yes, we're not all Grant Morrisons.
No.
Only Grant Morrison.
I don't even always understand reading his stuff. Although
I'm sure he doesn't either.
Yeah. But what I did want to talk about in terms of the finding your voice thing is I came to the wiki looking for Eldritch Horror, and that's what I started writing. Even though pretty quickly I abandoned that to start talking about more of a dramatic, almost spy fiction type of thing.
Yeah.
But it was always in a very serious bent. And I remember for the first few months of our friendship, I would look at the things that you read and I would complain to you, and I would be like, I don't know how to write funny. I can't do that. And it was. It was
absolutely
genuinely
convinced you could not be. You were like,
yeah.
No,
I was
funny.
100%. I'm like, I can be funny in a conversation. I can be funny yes-anding someone. I could be funny, at a bar. I cannot be funny on the page.
This is my favorite version of Green Eggs and Ham. I love it. I cannot be funny in a bar. I can be funny in my car. I can't be funny on the stage because I'm 40 years of age.
That's right. Although there are a lot of 40-year-olds on stage.
It was. I made that up extemporaneously. All right, I thought
a lot of white dudes on stage doing stand-up.
Oh God, no.
Yeah, I would never do that. But I was so convinced, utterly convinced. And it wasn't just me talking negative about myself. No, I was convinced I can't do that. I don't have the skills. I don't understand comedy. And then it just. And I don't know, I think it was reading more comedy. I read a lot of David Wong's stuff, that was his pseudonym, and I forget his real name, which he's come out as. But he's the one that wrote John Dies at the End, and There Are Spiders in this book. He's very funny. And I started reading much more of the comedy stuff on the wiki, including your stuff, which I, very much did find... inspiring, even though my comedy is nothing like yours, I don't do witty. I don't think I have it in me. It's not even what I want to write. I mean, I do a little bit. Lucretia can be witty, but that's a very fish out of water kind of wittiness that I like. But I started to read, more of a Famine Pulse's stuff, which is not intended to be funny, but is so absurd and strange that I started to realize, what if I started trying to do this, but not scary?
Yes, that's Famine Pulse. Famine Pulse is it's the David Lynch kind of funny, where it's just this is so off that it's funny.
Right. And I found that voice. I can still write serious stuff and character-based stuff, which I think is my strength, but. I was able to figure out how to write absurdity, and that's the kind of comedy I think I'm good at. Is what they said? What?
Yeah, exactly.
What happened just now on the page? Instead of the cleverness of the dialogue, it's more of a the fucking guy on the videotape said what now? Or just bizarre, ludicrous social commentary and whatnot, with a bit of rage tucked into the breast of a joke at all times.
Yes, you stick a couple of jokes in your existing stuff, usually from a designated character who's allowed to be funny, but when you write funny, you go right in with the absurd stuff. And whereas I have this thing where if I get too bored with myself, I just insert my characters joking at each other. So I basically am incapable of being completely serious for any long stretch of time, even if completely serious is what I'm supposed to be doing.
No, but I like that. I've learned from that, especially with the Clef and Vara stuff.
Yeah.
That it's mostly a serious series. alliteration.
Series.
But as frequently as possible, often in the beginning and towards the middle, there will be at least one moment where the two of them are exchanging something that is just funny. It's just meant to be funny.
Yeah, that's one of those things. You can just completely subvert a rule of writing, the rule where everything has to be contributing to the overall structure of the plot, which is true unless it's funny. You are allowed to subvert that to briefly be funny. Because that's important.
Yeah, if something is a distraction from the narrative, it's a bad thing unless it's funny. I think that's true.
Because if it's funny, it's keeping them from getting distracted from the narrative. It's keeping them on board.
Yeah, because no one is not engaged with a little bit of funny, as long as it actually is funny.
As long as it actually is funny.
Which I realize, and oftentimes I write stuff that I just think is funny, and I don't think I'm that funny in an original way when it comes to anything except for in certain modes of writing. And really it's just me copying some other people's styles or whatnot, but like the stuff that I reread Amnestic recently, which was the first Vikander Need article, and Disadron, who was my co-author, wrote a couple of the section in there, but I wrote like 2/3 of it. And I read my sections of it. Some of them just, I didn't like laugh out loud like a maniac, but like I was like, this is shit. Like I'm chuckling at the shit I read because it's just bizarre. Where did I even come up with this? And you were talking to me that day. I just kept coming back with snippets. Okay, what about this?
Yes, and that was what I think that's what cracked it, was that idea of just like I can put just completely insane snippets of weirdness in this, and I can just put an SCP frame on it and make people read it, and it works.
Yeah, and that's all Vikander. It's why it's so funny to me. Like today, I was talking to someone about Vikander Need on one of the Discord channels, and they were like, "Well, like I realize you're pretty hesitant to talk about like their overall goals, but like, do they have any?" And I just like spoilered the comment. That was no comment. Which was, I felt like very in tone, because I don't care. Like, I do have in my heart of hearts some actual answers about what the purposes of Vikander Need are and what they're doing, but I don't think I'll ever share that with anybody. Because that's not my point. That's just something I've thought about. The point has always been, what could I get away with, and what can I not get away with? And it's never about being offensive. I don't feel like I've ever touched on anything super sensitive, except for very clearly being on the side of the sensitive, I feel like the ones that were touching sensitive stuff were like very progressive ally, I hope, articles. And instead just being like, how uncomfortable can I make someone be without being an edgelord?
Yes.
Like, can I have someone giving a human resources orientation on a VHS invade the viewer's home while they're sleeping and then pee in their plant? Which I did to one of your characters.
To my designated character to have people pee in his plant, essentially.
Yeah, well, I love Weddle. Go read On Guard 43, people.
Yeah, here's our topic for next week then, making characters, because then I'll explain why I have designated characters for designated purposes.
Yeah. But the point is, I felt like I had to suffer through that insecurity to some extent about not being able to write comedy until, an idea came to me. I started experimenting with it a little bit with the Resurrection stuff in 2020 for the Renaissance Canon contest. But it wasn't until I wrote The Satellite that I feel like I went directly into it. And it was for, there was a contest last February, right? 2021 for Valentine's Day called the Cupid Contest. And it was supposed to be a story about romance of some sort or another. And I wrote a story about a satellite that was alive, becoming obsessed with televangelist and stalking him.
Yep, that was your coming out party, that one, where you're just crazy funny.
And people were like really surprised. I think that's why it did well, is like people were like, wait, Grigori doesn't write stuff like this. And I'm like, I haven't yet, but I do now, apparently.
Deal with it.
Yeah, and so I always think it's very funny that like I have such two very different modes that people know me for one or the other. Like, they know me for the very serious lore stuff, like whether it's Sarcasm or my series, or the Vanguard stuff from 6500, or Vikander Need ridiculousness, or a cup that makes you like, yeah, exactly. Which I think is pretty funny because people will be like, "Oh, I thought you just did the media stuff." I'm like, "Oh, well, actually, I write this very serious stuff about magic and horror." Actually,
there are two kinds of Grigori Karpin.
It is kind of just those two things, though. But
I wish I had two. I wish I had two modes. I would say the closest thing I have is that I have long and very long. Ladies.
Oh no, and I'm not cutting that out.
No, I wouldn't expect you to. It was almost an advertisement, wasn't it? Jeez.
Yeah, that's how it works.
Yeah.
He's on the market. Anyway, let's talk about our subject today, which is the Daevites.
The Daevites.
Yeah, so
it's the day of the Daevites. We would have done it earlier, but we were saving it for a rainy Daevite.
Are you just gonna go through these all right now?
No,
just gonna burn them all.
No. I'm
more.
Spacing them out.
Well, I guess it's a pretty easy one for the pun work.
Yeah, it's pretty easy.
So, I don't want to assume, but what was your first exposure to the Daevites? Was it 140?
It was 140 after 139 and 138 and 137 because when I started on the wiki, again on the wiki, I started reading from 001, read all the old 001s, then moved to 002 and so on and forward until I reached about, I don't know, maybe 200 and something before I just got so goddamn bored I started reading more recent things.
But you made it further than me. I made it like 30.
Yeah, there's some really bad stretches, especially immediately after 100. You just like the first 2 or 3 after that, it's like, oh my god, shut up. And then after the old man, it's back to, oh my god, 107 and 108, it's like, shut up.
But 106 is genuine.
106, the old man is a great one.
I know it's a tropey article. I know it's crazy famous, and everybody offside is, it's the creepy guy that goes to, yes, but
it's a good article.
Absolutely wonderful.
Yep. But I got to 140 when I got to 140, and it was one of the ones that I read where I went, this one's special. This is cool.
Yeah, that must have been a real... it must have been a real shock to the people at the time, because it was written, I think, in April of 2010, so the wiki had only been around for like a year and a half or something.
Yeah.
I bet you, I don't know, because I wasn't there, I bet you this made like waves, because... if you look at some of the other early articles and then you read 140, which is a chronicle of the Daeva, it's just like, what the? This is amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine he wrote that article and it just rewrote the history of the whole website.
God,
it's what I'm here for, man.
Just the puns.
Just the puns. That wasn't a pun. That was just
kind of clever. It was clever. You're right. It was.
Jeez.
Jesus Christ. I'm not sure, because my coming to the wiki was such a different from the normal mode. Like, I didn't come from TV tropes. I came because someone recommended metaphysician stuff to me, which is why
that is a good way to show up. Yeah.
Yeah. No. And so I read all his stuff and then started to kind of peek around. So there's stuff that I'm still filling in the blanks on. For example, for last week's episode, for the Church of the Broken God, I hadn't read, most of that stuff before.
Yeah, me either.
Same thing with the GOC.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah, I mean, there are other subjects that we covered that I did obviously love, but...
I'm looking forward to the week where I've already done all my homework. I'm not sure which one that'll be, but... Well, yeah, did a lot of this already.
The third moon...
The 3 Moon Initiative, yeah, that's right.
I always say third. I'm so sorry.
Was that my first episode?
No, your first episode was GOC.
Okay, I was gonna say I can't wait till the episode where I've already done all my homework. Meanwhile, it was my first one or whatever.
I mean,
I have no functioning memory whatsoever.
Yeah, who cares? It's not important for writing.
This is why I write things down. I write things down so that I don't have to remember them.
That's the way it
get
works
all my stories out before my brain's
That's the way it works. That's the secret to actual intellectual professionals, is that we all have learned so much that our memory is faulty, and so we have to constantly take notes for everything.
Right. So you all think we're putting stories there for you guys to read them, but it's actually so that they don't just perish.
Well, yeah, that's
Publish or perish.
True and very different.
What the hell are we talking about?
140.
140.
So SCP-140
is by?
If you don't know, Assertive Roland. Who has only written 4 things, one of which is a tale connected to SCP-140, which is also very good. It's called A Visitation, which I also really recommend. It's wonderful. And SCP-140 is about a book. And it is the sort of prototypical magic book. But the minute you start reading about what this book is, all the tropes are out the window. I genuinely don't know if I've ever read anything before or since that used a book in this way.
Yeah.
I genuinely, it wasn't like he took, like, an old trope and gave it new life. Like, it's really original.
It's quite original. It's a good trope. It's a good new trope.
Yeah. And I was just talking to him recently. Thank you, Gwari, who introduced us. And he told me that, and which is something I really relate to, is that at the time, a lot of the articles that were coming out were so based in actual science or just horror that he was like, well, why isn't there more, like, humanities stuff, like history and sociology and stuff like that? And it's so clear now, reading 140, that he had interest in, like when we were talking, I told him I had studied anthropology in undergrad. It was, oh yeah, okay, I see why you appreciate this.
Yeah, there's professors in this story. I mean, so
yeah. And I think it also was the first thing I read. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
no, it
wasn't,
because I read the Sarkic stuff and it referenced the Daeva.
Of course.
So yeah. But so I had some concept of who the Daeva was before I read the 140. But so it's a book that, if it comes into contact with any fluid suitable for writing, including human blood, the account of the Daevite civilization's history expands. So it's a history book, but it's written much more like a biography. And
we haven't actually named it. It's called A Chronicle of the Daevas. No, you didn't.
I said it early.
No, you didn't.
Yeah, I did.
We'll go back to the tapes and they'll confirm.
And
if they confirm that I'm wrong, I will just assume that you did.
You're not going to listen to it. Doesn't matter.
That's true. We established that. It's canonical that I don't listen to these. Yes, it's a history of the Daevite civilization.
Right, and it's told from very very dramatic and personal sort of perspectives. It's not like a dry academic work, but the thing is that it actually expands every time that this liquid comes near it. And including human blood, they say, and then the next paragraph literally says, or the next sentence, human blood appears to be the most potent, in quotation marks, of possible writing substances, but in any case, the amount of new material does not correspond proportionately to the fluids introduced. So, I don't really know what more potent means in that situation.
Yeah.
But what this means is the book is constantly expanding anytime it's being exposed to liquid you could write with. So, not just ink, but if you think about all the different ways that you could write a message in.
Yeah.
Which,
we'll just not interrogate that at all, because I imagine this book is very unsanitary.
Yeah. And it probably smells.
Yeah, it probably smells.
Although it doesn't actually say that it's written in the blood.
And also there are multiple copies of this book.
Right.
Quite a few copies of this book. So they're obviously not all.
Or something.
Yeah, I think they all correspond to whatever you write in the one.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting because this book is constantly changing if it gets exposed to liquid, but that's not really the intriguing thing. The intriguing thing is reality is changed because of how this book is expanded. So the Daevites were a people from 10,000 BC until, at least originally, they had been vanquished somewhere around, I can't remember, I think it was 500 BCE or something like that. And then each time that the book has been expanded, at least the one that is in the Foundation's containment, from the perspective of this article, history has been changed such that it allows for those people to recover from whatever their horrible event was, whether it was a catastrophic loss or some sort of drought or famine or whatever. And what's interesting and very clearly explained, and then was also confirmed when I talked to Assertive Roland, was that people's memories are not changed. So it's not rewriting all of reality. It's just making these things retroactively part of history without necessarily changing the way people understood it to be before. So you could remember the last time you looked at the book that the Daevites had ended at a certain date. And then once it's expanded, how things are changed in the real world is now there's evidence of those changes out there. History has changed to reflect the expansion of the book. Memories are not, like I just said, but it is supported by literal archaeological evidence, despite the fact that they wouldn't have been there before, meaning that if there were digs that were already existent in a certain place, and they have certain examples in the article, now, once the book has been expanded, you might find evidence that wasn't there a week ago, that the Daevite had lived past where we thought they were in a different area than they were before, or whatever.
Yes.
So when the book was originally discovered, that Daeva culture had died out, and then each time they're expanded, the history has been extended further. So it seems to be like a second chance each time. Like, what used to be the wiping out of that culture now has become a thing where, okay, this was a serious defeat, but then they retreated and regrouped and, were able to start a new capital somewhere else or whatever.
Yeah, I think a way to look at it is to think of it in terms of those slasher movie franchises, like Friday the 13th or Halloween or Nightmare on Elm Street, where how come each one of these ends with a conclusive defeat of the bad guy, and then the next movie has to go, that didn't actually happen like that. He's actually still out there. And that's kind of how the Daeva work. Each time there's a sequel, it's like, guess what? They made it out of the burning building, which was their civilization.
Right. And the horror is that this comes from, it doesn't clearly state that there's a compulsion to it, but it does talk about it. The person that owned the book when the Foundation found it was a history professor who was found with all these horrible slash wounds on his wrists because he was looking to expand the book. So he was feeding blood to the book, and he leaves a note, effectively a suicide note, although I don't think he meant to kill himself, saying, "I'm sorry, I had to know."
Yeah.
And so, and Roland, when I was talking to him, was like, well, there isn't specific compulsion. It's just people being, like, genuinely curious about this mystery. And it's like, that's still pretty messed up, though.
You have to be pretty damn curious.
And then that's all before you even look at the details of what the Daeva civilization is. Which is its own sort of, like, colonialist horror story. But the changes include new, more recent accounts of information chronicling the continued history of the Daevite civilization, or descriptions of new individuals and artifacts. Formerly decisive defeats become setbacks, like I said, but then newer persons and events are inserted, meaning that history is actually being changed not just from the end point, but like throughout, retroactively. Foundation archaeologists have discovered corresponding new artifacts and traces of Daevite civilization in applicable locations and strata. But what's interesting is that the book includes lurid descriptions of sacrificial rites, battlefield descriptions, daily life, and the life stories of various noteworthy individuals, including quotes and dates of birth. It's not looking so much at the, like, larger societal, like, upheavals, and, like, it's looking at, it's like a very personal history. And part of that is because the history is presented in such a way as the culture is stagnant's not the right word, because they seem very vibrant, but it doesn't ever seem to change. Like, it's been around, for almost 10,000 years, and yet it's always the same. At least the way that the book presents it.
Yes, and later authors will make a lot of hay out of that, as we'll see.
Right. And, like, to some extent, even a sort of Roland is making a lot of hay out of that, because it's very clear that the book has not been in publication since the Daeva. The book is, it's implied maybe since, in the 20th century some point. And it's been published, seemingly funded by a person who is designated SCP-140-A, who is not specific about in terms of gender, and no details are given about them. But it's a person who seems to be referred to in the book. Yeah. Does that mean he wrote the book? The article is of the opinion that no, this person is not the person who wrote the book. The Foundation, they are looking for the author as a separate thing. So they're looking for this -A, who's the person who's out there spreading the book around. But then they're also looking for the author. So if this person is not the one that wrote it, well, who the heck is it? Is this a survivor? Just somebody who just was a devotee of the Daeva? Like, it's genuinely unclear, and it's added to the fact that there's, like, all this mystery to it. You know, and I think in a lot of ways it was an early attempt to, like, talk about some fairly deep stuff on the wiki, because it is talking about that personal bias in history from the perspectives of, like, the people who write them and the people that, like, go about, not just write them, but, like, the people that publish books have a hand in shaping what history actually is.
Absolutely.
And, you know, it doesn't... I think that aspect of it gets probably lost in the fact that it's a book that gets fed by blood. Because you could also use maple syrup. You don't need to use blood. It's there because the article is supposed to be a little spooky. And it is. And the Daevites themselves are this... you know, civilization that owned slaves and were these horrible colonials, and, like, they did blood magic, and, you know, a lot of stuff is fleshed out over the years since. But I think the real horror, in a lot of ways, is the, like, shaping of history. And in this case, it just happens to be literal, but, you know, that's what a good metaphor does.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a few of the other articles as they dig into it better. But there's a few things I want to just quickly say about 140, if you'll allow me. There's the two things that I like the most about it. The one thing is the retroactive changing of history, because I think probably one of my absolute favorite things in any media franchise ever is the thing that happens in The Elder Scrolls III, Morrowind, in the ancient background of the story, where a couple of fairly normal people find a dead god's heart and profanely manipulate the dead god's heart to make them into gods. But because of the nature of Godhead in their universe and the nature of the tools and the nature of the heart, they become always were gods.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Reality is altered so that they always had been gods, and it just generates this whole panoply of fucking weird effects. And I love that. I love the concept of retro-causality. So seeing it come up in here is just like, that's so cool. It's not just changing what happened, it's changing what happened so that was always what happened. And that's the power of fiction. That's a kind of thing that we have no experience of in the real world, except for in the sense that you can change a narrative of history and make everybody believe that that's what happened, which is kind of what's going on here as well. And 6140 talks about that a lot more. But the other thing is on a much more superficial level that I still love. Everybody knows the scary concept of the thing that's coming and is getting closer. The thing you see in the rear view mirror and it's closing. The T-Rex in Jurassic Park, objects in the rear view mirror may be closer than they appear. The thing that's coming and it's coming, it's going to get you. The Yule Man is coming to your house or whatever the hell. Or as Tim and Eric put it, Winter Man is coming at you through the forest to your house. But this is completely a wacky-ass version of that, because it's the Daevites are coming towards us from the past. Because the more the book gets written, the closer they get chronologically to still being here. And that's so cool.
It is incredible. And that's like the real, really effective fridge horror aspect of it.
Yeah.
That by the end of the article, you're like, wait, how much has their history been expanded? And they just throw in like the time, and Roland throws in this very brief sentence that states that as of last recording, the book has the decisive defeat of the Daevas being in the early aspects of the career of Genghis Khan. So that's way into CE, because Genghis Khan was way later than 2500 BC or whatever it was.
They're coming.
Yeah, and so they're already not far away.
Factory. They're all going to be here.
Right. And so, I think you're right. I think that one of the funnest things about, other than the interesting intellectual, like the aspects of history and the creepy society that existed on Blood or whatever.
Yes.
Is this thing that's creeping, a slouching thing out of Bethlehem or whatever. Only it's coming. I completely paraphrased that poorly, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm fighting myself. I can quote that one for heart, but
Go ahead.
I meant I could do the whole poem.
Don't do that.
I'm not going to do that. We're not doing Poetry Hour with Harry Blank,
No.
But you are speaking, of course, of what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
Exactly.
The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. My favorite poem, as we will all see when I release my 001 proposal.
It's a very good poem. But this thing that's like the crawling chaos in this situation is crawling towards us from the past, and that is, like you said, pretty unique. It's a different take on that, and that's yet again another aspect of this that is like very original. But the thing that I find really interesting about that is that they are constantly being pushed forward because of like the arrogant need to know.
Yes.
Because if there is no compulsion, as Roland told me himself, there is no compulsion to add to this book. It's just literally people's curiosity. So there's no part of this anomaly that forces people to do it. It's not one of those things that makes you crazy. It's not one of those things that like controls your body, or like there's no god or entity in the book. No, the only thing that happens to it is if it gets exposed, it retrocausally changes history.
Yep.
And so every time it gets added to, it's like, well, who did it? Why? What? Come on.
Yeah, come on, man. Who fed the blood book again?
But then, the article is fairly vague on who the Daeva are. It kind of adds in some interesting implications about how they are. But over the years, there's been sort of this general picture painted, and it's incredibly variable. And luckily, it's one of the things where there is no canon. Makes perfect sense because the first thing that was written about them was something that changes history. And so if one story talks about the Daeva, for example, later on we're going to talk about several of the things that talk about the Daeva worshipping the Scarlet King, a thing that's on the wiki, and other ones that are like, no, that has nothing to do with them. And that makes perfect sense because, well, maybe when one of the times the book was expanded, and maybe a different copy of it was expanded in a different way compared to this copy, are there competing timelines and they're all mushing into our world? It's just fascinating stuff. But it was, kind of expanded IRL by many different authors because Assertive Roland, like I said, only wrote 4 things, 2 of which are related to the Daeva. And it kind of caught fire slowly but surely. There aren't like dozens and dozens of articles. There are many articles that are tagged with Daevite, the tag, but most of them, and spoiler for later, most of them are unsatisfying if you want to learn about the Daeva, because they use the Daeva as like a historical like earmark, essentially. They're just saying, hey, these people existed a long time ago. Look, the Daeva were there too. And then the article gets tagged Daevite, and then you're left wondering, well, I don't understand. What does that to do with Daeva? Nothing. Okay.
Yeah, the Daevite are the equivalent of bumping into Ernest Hemingway so that we remember what time period a time travel story is.
But there are some dedicated Daevite articles, all of which, I mean, very few of any of the ones that actually have to do with Daevites have not been spectacular, in my opinion. And I don't know why that is, but it never has caught on. There aren't like 50 articles that are all about the Daeva. There may be a couple dozen. And through those articles, in different ways, they've been expanded to be this colonial empire that's spreading out from central Siberia. They're originally loose confederation of city-states, but they very quickly become this sort of stratified empire that is led by matriarchs, not monarchs, but women of power both politically and religiously. And yet they're also like colonialists. They are enslaving, conquering, fairly horrible people. They love sacrificing people. They do a lot of weird blood magic. And interestingly enough, they also like agriculture.
This isn't the only time in the wiki that just gets thrown out there. Likes all of these horrible things, and also
they had a real green thumb. So not all bad.
Except for when you see what they were farming.
Right. Some of them aren't that weird.
They range from creepy to horrifying. Really.
Yeah.
Are you about to tell me that the heads aren't creepy? Okay, go on.
The heads are. The one that tells people's like history, though, I don't know if that's creepy exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Why do we care?
Getting ahead of ourselves.
Oh, nice.
Ahead.
Why do we care about the Daeva? I know I care because I think that 140 is like a huge inspiration to me. Along with, the Sarcasm, Daevites have always been like a significant... Like I mentioned 140 in my first article. And people were like, oh, are you sure you want to mention a famous article in your first article? Yes, I am.
That's one of those
Yes,
things
I am
where
sure.
people know that you're supposed to say a thing, but they don't know that there's a context to it. You're supposed to say that if your article is about your cool monster fighting 682. You're not supposed to say that if 140 is actually relevant to the plot, which it is.
Yes.
You sure you want to
And I
mention
think-
that thing that's key? Yeah.
Yeah. It's like this really important context for the early stages of that article.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I do want to do that, because otherwise I have to invent it from scratch, and that defeats the purpose of writing on this website.
I mean, the rest of that article is me just completely creating something from scratch.
Yes, it is. Which is the other good
Which was
reason.
so funny that like I use the Daevite in the same way that I find slightly annoying that other people use it, was that I use it as historical context.
Yes.
Although I always had intended to bring them and make them part of the series, which I did, but it did take a few articles.
Yes.
And so the impact of the Daeva is like throughout the fictional history of the wiki, not like the development of the wiki itself, but it was the Daeva that the Sarkics were fighting their rebellion against. So the reason that there is Sarkicism, according to the lore, is that they were rebelling against the Daevite Empire.
Yep.
It was the Daeva that created some of the earliest, like, in the outline I'm saying human-made because there are lots of weird elder gods or, things that are unexplainable. But the Daeva are the first, like, society in the Foundation's universe, at least as far as we know, that was, like, creating things that were anomalous.
Yes.
And lots of those things still exist. And so they will continue to show up to the present day, which is why the Foundation gives a shit. And also, the ever-changing history of the Daeva, as we've already discussed, because of SCP-140, allows for like all sorts of different interesting variations that all fit. It doesn't have to be like a multiverse story. No, it could all be in the same universe because of the way that book works.
Yeah, you just imagine every time they find a new David thing, they go, "Oh, for Christ's sake, this isn't even going to make sense, is it?"
Yeah, I know the grander file of the Daevite project at the Foundation is just like we don't.
Yeah.
We say we're researching it, but we're just collating weird shit that makes no sense.
Yeah, they start a new article and they're like, "Should we pull the Daeva file?" And the lead researcher's like, "Do you have the vague gist of how they work?" And they're like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "Well, then the file's not gonna fucking help. This will be its own thing. As long as you know who they are, we'll just keep going. Don't worry about it."
Yeah, and I mean it's fun because the original article didn't deal with them being matriarchs. That got added later on, and I'm actually not sure which was the first one that brought that up, but it is this interesting, it might have been 392, but it's this interesting aspect that's like juxtaposed against the fact that they are this matriarchal society that many people would want to assume would not be as horrible as our traditionally patriarchal society. Mm-hmm. But in reality they're still like stratified society about oppressing other people, and there is kind of this interesting, there's some interesting commentary there, I think.
Absolutely.
And also the fact that there is something about there's never not been in I think every series there's at least one, if not more than one, famous article that is really impactful on the wiki that has to do with the Daeva, that didn't just use it as a reference, but instead was this really key part of it. Like one of the best articles submitted for 6000, you've already mentioned it, 6140, is all about the Daeva and subverting expectations.
In fact, they are often quite easy to spot from a distance because they have numbers like
Right.
2140, 3140, 4140.
Right. Which is fun because it's always different. It has almost always. Most people have not written more than one article about the Daevites, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's like a group roundabout thing.
And like I said, there's things that matter. Until this day, 14 years later. Well, 12 years later, because it was in 2010.
Yeah.
That people are still writing about this. Myself included, who has made them a central part of my series, and also recently wrote, for the first time somebody wrote a Daevite hub, which was me. Mm-hmm. Which is weird that it didn't happen before then, but, I'm sure a lot of people experienced the same thing that I experienced and then just said, fuck it, I'll do it anyway, which was, do I have the right to do this? Like, I'm just some guy who came to the wiki, years after this became a thing.
Yes, well, we added Grigori Karpin to the wiki, and it sucked him in, and it output a hub. It retroactively made it so that there was a Daevite hub. I'm going to ride this metaphor for the next hour. guaranteed.
Yeah.
I'm not going to let it go.
All right, well, let's talk about some of these articles.
Yeah, let's do that.
All right. So, SCP-392, which is the heads, which you mentioned before.
That's not what it's called.
No, I love the title, though. The title is A Plant Now Found in Site 103 and Formerly in the Households of Nobility.
It's a good title. It's cute.
It rhymes.
A plant now found in Site 103 and formerly in the households of nobility. It does rhyme. It's nice.
It's really good. And it also is just, like, very evocative, but it doesn't have, like, a creepypasta title, even though it, is kind of a creepypasta idea, even though the execution is really great. And this is yet another Series 1 that is, like, when this, was first dropped, you can't read the original right now on the wiki. You'd have to go back to an earlier rendition because it was rewritten in 2016 by Mr. Wrong, who is the same guy who wrote the first one, I believe. But I don't actually know. You know what? I'm going to hold. I don't know if that's true.
Are we still talking about 392?
Right.
Crom says it's straight Mr. Wrong, and he would have extra attribution.
Okay, great.
Attribution data if it was anybody else. So.
Yeah, so I was basing this off of his author post, but that was kind of an interpretation. But which is interesting because the original one had much more of a story, a narrative, and then this newer one is interestingly it feels more like a Series 1 than what I hear was the original one.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what is this anomaly? So it's a peach tree, but this peach tree has been altered through anomalous means, magic, who knows. Such that each of the fruit resembles an identical human male head. It even shows tattoos. This is how they realize that it's connected to the daylights, the Foundation anyway, because the tattoos that are seen on the heads indicate the individual was a concubine or a slave to a Daevite matriarch, and it was believed it was some sort of beloved slave, because this was her way of immortalizing this man.
Right.
What's really creepy, I mean, there's so many aspects of it that are creepy. What's really creepy is that the heads are kind of alive. They're not peaches. And they exhibit neurological and reflex responses. And the article even has like a collapsible menu of just examples of the types of neurological responses this disembodied human head that grows on a peach tree.
And I find them very distressing.
They are. I'm going to list them off, but they're good body horror.
Like,
they're really good body horror.
They're really subtle. The last thing on the table, it's like, ew, get away from that thing.
And it was found. Let's see. It was found. Well, anyway, I didn't write that down. But apparently, during the Warring States period, which is a Chinese history era, which is 475 BCE to 221 BCE. I don't know if those numbers are exactly accurate. I know that the ending point is accurate because that's when the Qin Empire started, which is the first emperor. But SCP-392 would be cultivated by the soldiers, the Chinese soldiers, who harvested and skinned the heads, and the skulls would then be passed off as executed enemy combatants and presented to officials in exchange for promotion and other rewards.
I love that.
For example, peerage, titles, lands, and slaves.
That's great. That is great.
Just what the fuck?
That's one of those sentences where you're writing your main thing, and then this other idea occurs to you, and you're like, "This is the gravy right here. I'm sticking this in. This is fun."
It's like Mr. Wrong was sitting there thinking about, like, okay, this is such a creepy story. Okay, I'm writing this story about the heads, and they grow in a peach tree, and this society is very strange, and look at how little they value human life, that they, want to recreate this person's life through a disembodied head growing on a plant. Well, what would they do with the heads?
Yes.
Yes. I know.
Here's a fun story.
It's just like the tiny little paragraph, and it's just like, wow, you could write a whole thing about that. But it's really, I think it's really iconic in terms of, the thing that the Daevites do. They almost always are connected with one of three things, which was retrocausality, some sort of blood sacrifice creepiness, or agriculture.
Yeah, especially like horticulture, especially growing like flowers and trees and shit. They're just really into that for some reason.
Right. Yeah. And I recently referenced it in a recent tale, which was a Parawatch tale called "In the Carpathians."
Yeah, it's
and
very.
Thank you. And I made a really fun, very proud of image of one of these heads.
Yeah, that's a good recent article in the Carpathians by Grigori Karpin and Pentagon.
Yeah, that's about it. Okay, so SCP-214. Actually, you want to take a break?
Yeah, let's take a break.
Where were we? Oh, yeah, that's right. SCP-2140 Retroconverter, which by Sir Pudding, which does a complete 180 from the stuff we've already been talking about in a really interesting way.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So it starts off as described as a Foundation-developed anomaly that's an image that when you look at it, 100% of the people that look at it, their entire history is rewritten, such that they retroactively become loyal Foundation personnel with a clearance level of 2 or higher, specific to this anomaly. So it doesn't matter who the person is. They could be a civilian, they could be a traitor, they could be, an enemy combatant. If they look at this image, all of a sudden history has changed such that they were always part of the Foundation, which is pretty scary in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so it's a very, very effective motivational poster of a cat with the Foundation logo on it. That instantly converts everyone. They're like, I like that cat, so I'm in. So SCP-3140.
That's right, that's all we need to talk about. So, the anomaly is, in a way, it's not quite explicit in the way that it's connected to the Daevites. But it is actually, once you've dug into it, derived from a Daevite anomaly. The connection to the Daevites is sort of tenuous, but it is pretty clear once you read the entire article and kind of examine it. Because they find alternate versions of this image at a dig site. And it's later discovered that the people that were studying it were a covert cell within the Foundation dedicated to the recreation of Redacted, and were killed resisting capture. And a quote from it is, ultimately, NTF N10 suffered 3 casualties as a result of SCP-2140-1D exposure. That's the alternate image. Agent Swanson was presumably exposed first, and then deliberately affected Agents Kim and Okoro. Subsequently, these 3 agents were discovered to have represented another deep cell, despite originating on these 3 separate continents and knowing each other for less than a year, and were killed attempting to access SCP-140. So, you have to kind of read into it that seeing this alternate image made these people, all of the same mind, even though they barely knew each other, and all dedicated to getting their hands on SCP-140. So it seems that, if I'm interpreting correctly, originally the Daevite used this image in a similar fashion to the way that the Foundation is using it, in that they turned themselves into allies or people that were, reliably connected to the cause of the Daevite Empire. And somebody had left one of these images in a ruin of some sort, and was found by these people that turned them into, retroactively, a cell of people that were dedicated to the cause of the Daevites, even though, it's been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yep.
But what's really fascinating about it is that it has to be read between the lines, because it doesn't, it's tagged Daevite, but, Daevite is never mentioned in the specific word in the article. And what I thought was really interesting was, in response to a comment in the discussion board, when asked, why is this Thaumiel, which, Thaumiel is an object class meaning that it can help to contain other anomalies in the fiction of the Foundation.
Yes.
And Sir Pudding gave a numerical list and said, well, it could be used to counteract the effect of any alternate imagery instance, specifically these, it can counteract anybody that's seen these other types, which is interesting because what this is implying is that the real original anomaly was the Daevite version, and somehow the Foundation figured that out and adapted it, and then didn't inform any of the people that are researching it. It can be used to counteract any anomaly that works by conversion, possession, and transformation, so on, as long as the victim is still sapient and capable of viewing the glyphs, with the side effect that the person will now have a loyal Foundation member with a 2/2/140 clearance. But that's probably better than being a meat puppet for space worms or whatever.
Oh, that's a great sentence. A meat puppet for space worms. I love it.
They could use it to turn moles, which, like we've already said, if you were a traitor to the organization, to instantly recruit, in parentheses, presumably in an emergency. Oh my gosh, we're so short-handed. Go get someone from that gas station. I gotta show them something. Or as a weapon by turning enemies into allies. As a weapon, it's just as useful tactically as it is strategically, which it would be. If the Foundation was faced with a genuine threat of breaking of the veil, showing a shit ton of people that were in danger of threatening the veil, this image would suddenly make them less likely to reveal it because they are now loyal Foundation members. But this kind of shows, the reason I include is it's really smart. It's a really fun, very short article. I think when it was originally published, it was maybe 500 words. It's been expanded a little bit, but it's all implication. If you just look at it in basic text form, it's just this thing that the Foundation can use to brainwash people. But there's multiple layers of it that are really creepy. First of all, the Foundation having this thing is really creepy. But then also digging into it and reading into the footnotes to realize, oh my goodness, this is based on something that existed for hundreds and hundreds of years in connection to the Daevites. So it's yet another tool in their arsenal to change history.
I think that's cool. I think it's very cool the way that it's completely relying on the reader to pick up on the cues, which is something that is always scary to do. I tend to err on the side of making sure they know what the hell I'm talking about, but I have a great deal of respect for people who will have the courage to post fridge horror.
Yeah, that where you have to be intriguing enough that people are wait, what just happened? I want to dig into this, and then leave just enough breadcrumb trail to make sure that the connection is there and concrete without ever being explicit. It's a very masterfully done article, and the other ones that try and do the same thing are also very impressive because it can fail real bad.
It definitely can, and people will just go, I don't know what the hell this is. It's failing to make its point, so downvote.
Right. Although there are plenty of articles that at the end of it I go, I don't know what I just read, but I thought it was fascinating. Upvote.
Yes, I work that way as well. Because we are the same person.
Yeah, well, that's true. We are. So, another 140 article is 3140, which is Botanical Warfare by Nat Voltaic. And this is...
Grigori loves this article.
I do love this article. It is ridiculous. But it's told in this very, it's still it's Series 4, and it's early Series 4, and not just because of the number, but when it was published. And it's very clinical. It's very dedicated to the format of the SCP. But the thing it's talking about is fucking ridiculous, and I love it. It is, just to get down to brass tacks, it's a tree golem.
It's a tree golem.
It's an animate tree that has been modified by the Daevites to use as shock troops.
Yeah.
And it's very specifically the early Daevite, because they didn't originate this practice of growing soldiers out of wood, because it's implied, and then not implied, it's directly stated in a footnote that it's actually SCP-1000 that created this, or Bigfoot.
Bigfoot, the children of the night.
Children of the night, yes.
What sweet giant tree golems they make.
Well, to be fair, the Daevites did adapt them to warfare. So the addition that the Daevites make to them is making them capable of projectile fire.
I was sure you were going to say vomiting, even knowing what you were going to say.
No.
It was a real pregnant pause. Daevites made them projectile vomit.
They projectile vomit from a cannon, and that cannon fired what the Foundation believes was some sort of like organic napalm.
Yes.
And the Daevites also put into like effect a series of like thaumaturgical runes that not only allow for control with certain like control words, but also make them incredibly resistant to like fire and erosion. So these tree golems are like shock troops. They're like tanks from an RPG. They can go in the middle of the battle and they won't get fucked up by much, and you'd have to like sustainably like rain damage on them to do anything significant. And also they can fire effectively napalm from a cannon.
I like that you're taking the tactical theology approach to this one.
What do you mean?
Like if I had to fight these in an RTS, how would I do it?
That's right. Well, I have written several articles where people had to fight them.
I think fighting ridiculous kinds of monsters, this must be because you've been playing Elden Ring. You're already in that mindset. How would I fight this tree golem? It's
so dangerous to bring that up. There are tree golems in it. We're not going to get into it, but I could talk about this game forever. Anyway, this is a thing that the Foundation found in a dig site, which is fascinating because it's still alive, and it's the only extant instance that they've found. This is a living tree golem that they found buried. So the fact that it's not only resistant to erosion and fire, but also apparently like entropy and age, you know. They dig it up, and you know the firing mechanism on its cannon doesn't work anymore. But otherwise, this thing is, you know, cognizant. These things cannot speak. They don't seem to be sapient, but they are alive and animate. And what's interesting is they find texts in SCP-1726, which is not specifically a Daevite article, but it is an article that references the Daevites, and it is like this. Effectively, I've described it as a mystical library in China, but that's basically what it is. It is a library in ancient China that's been around for thousands of years and is being controlled by some eldritch thing. Kind of a precursor to the Wanderer's Library in some ways. I don't know if it was before then, but that's how it's presented.
Right.
And also references in SCP-40 in universe chronicle the development of the botanical warfare of this specific kind of thing, this tree golem. And what's funny is the Foundation, being the Foundation, decides, well, could we grow some?
Of course.
And they do! And they grow a couple of them, although neither of them are capable of firing, and they have variable success.
Yeah, that's just beautiful. Well, hey, now that we've got the idea of tree golem in our head, let's give it a go.
I mean, we want to see if it's reproducible. That's an important aspect of science, Harry.
Yes, and I'm sure that's the whole sum total of their reasoning for doing this.
But what's really interesting, at least from this discussion about the Daevites in general, is that it actually, in very brief form, adds some interesting world building, further fleshing out the Daevites. And it says that SCP-3140-1, which is the only one they have until they start growing them, was discovered at a Foundation archaeological dig site near Bikito, Jammu, and Kashmir, Republic of India, in January 2017. The dig site appeared to have at one point been the location of a battle between Daevite forces and an unknown Ortorthan group. Ortorthans are the Church of the Second Hyctoth. We will eventually cover it. We're not going to go into it right now.
Right.
Based on the presence of non-anomalous weapons and armor possessing acute heptagrams, sometimes surrounded by other polygons, regular polygons ranging from 4 to 7 sides, and humanoid figures with 4 to 7 arms, which is all relevant to like Ortorthans. But the said battle is believed to have occurred at some point in the early Low Daevic period, somewhere around 11,000 BCE, suspected to be the Century Conquest, a war waged by the Daevites on a wide number of civilizations in Asia, lasting for 1,000 years or so. Basically, it's the big push by the Daevas in the early period of their history to conquer everything in Central Asia. And what I think is pretty fascinating is by this point in the development of the GUI of the Daeva, it was pretty clear it was still like the Wild West, right? There wasn't that much expansion of the concepts. We had the peach tree, We had the retro converter. There were a couple other articles that mentioned it, but specifically, this centers the core idea of the Daeva being interested in horticulture.
Yes.
Because other articles take this and run with it. And so it becomes this core, and this is why I find it so interesting, because it's just an example of that collaborative aspect of the wiki, where different authors can take tiny snippets of ideas from previous articles that worked and say, oh, well, if they made one weird tree, they probably made others.
Yes. This is something we saw with Fifthism, too, where the earliest example of the thing is fairly low key, and it's doing one thing, and it's doing its thing very well, but it's not doing much else. It's it's got one target, and it hits the target, and there isn't necessarily the immediate sense of broad scope. And then later people look at it and go, well, how do I build on this? And the answer is you build on it.
Right. Only that one was really interesting because the original creator kept popping back in. Like Silver Escher, cool. Silver Escher kept popping back in to be like, well, I've got another idea here, and it's all going to make perfect sense.
In its inimitable Silver Escher way of not making any sense.
Right, yes. I mean, and that's kind of... These are, I think, the two most, in terms of, like, being mysterious. Fifthism and the Daevites are both, been touched on by so many different authors in so many different ways, but... the only thing that any of them really have in common are certain core tenets, and otherwise, the field is open.
Right.
When I did the hub, the thing about making a hub is you're supposed to at least, ostensibly include some, not instructions, but some guidance for people to contribute. And basically, I was like, you know what? You're pretty open. You can write almost anything you want as long as it has one of these key aspects.
And that's one of the beauties of it, is it's there's a lot there if you want to look at it, and if you don't want to look at all of it, just look at the key ones, and then you can start contributing.
Yeah. And further along those lines is SCP-3399, not a 140. Oh my goodness.
Oh my gosh, must have been unavailable.
Well,
it was.
It was. We just covered it. Called Family Tree by Mordos. Another tree. Another tree. And this tree is one that grows leaves which play out memories from a person who sacrifices some blood onto the tree as it's growing.
Yes.
The leaves will not only play out their memories and important life events, it will also predict future events. Specifically, those individuals likely to provide a good pairing for procreation. Additionally, yeah, I know. And additionally, the leaves will identify possible genetic defects in potential offspring or in the person who's making the blood sacrifice. Because in the table in this article, one of the D class has been, is sterile, cannot, have children. And when they sacrifice a little bit of blood as part of the experiment, the tree it grows healthy but never produces any seeds. Yes. Another one has been diagnosed with cancer, although I think it's a remission or something. And so the tree is twisted and gnarled and never, it is riddled with cancer itself.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that the article says the researchers believe that the anomaly was used to manipulate bloodlines in the ruling Daeva families. Yes. Which already tells you, okay, here's how important it is that we create a sustainable, ruling class. We need to dedicate resources to making a magic tree that when you sprinkle some blood on it and it grows, we can tell who would be a good mate.
And what's really funny about that is it says explicitly that, in 14% of cases, even if you've got somebody, it's got somebody else in mind. Right. I think that's really interesting. It's this is the Daevite Tinder, which is appropriate because it's a tree.
Right.
He's going to cut the pause. I know you're going to cut the pause so that it looks like you got the joke immediately.
Not now.
Now you can't. I screwed you over.
A table shows... so the tree was found surrounding a Daevite shrine, but there were dozens and dozens, I think they said 70 or something like that, instances of this tree, all reflecting the life of one specific piece, one specific royalty family of these Daevites. 73 instances. And all of the trees all the time are showing images displayed on the leaves of these persons' lives. And then the last note, and it says that matching the style of dress and cultural surroundings believed to be associated with Daevite royalty. And the last note is that they take one of the trees and move it to a site and just burn the rest. Which is the most Foundation thing ever. It's like, look at this fascinating... This is, the first thing we've talked about from the Daevites that isn't immediately horrifying. Like, it has horrifying implications, in my opinion. Like, if you're so concerned with bloodlines, and it certainly shows a cheapness of human, free will and all those different things. But, it's just a tree that plays out memories, which should be just a magical, wonderful thing. And the Foundation is just like, cool, we got one. We're going to make sure it survives. We're going to put it in one of these sites. We're going to keep it fed and do some research. What do we want to do with the rest of them? Burn them.
Yes. Well, if we don't burn them, somebody else might get it, and that's against the whole principle here. This is ours.
Got to contain things.
Ours.
But yeah, just as a sort of closing thought, I think it's really interesting because this is a fairly subtle contribution to the worldview of the Daevas, but it does a really interesting job of focusing in the Daevas on preserving bloodlines. And the first article even says that the SCP-140 says that the Daevites were, potentially these anomalous humans, long-living, capable of weird anomalous capabilities, powers and whatnot. And you would think that those types of people would also be very concerned with making sure that those bloodlines survived. And this is a 10,000-year-long empire, right?
Yeah. This is the kind of crap you get from really big established empires where they've gotten so inward-looking and decadent that they're making trees to reproduce their concubines and making trees to check their bloodlines. And the Daevites are just being so fucking gross at this point because they're late-stage empire, basically.
Right. Exactly. Speaking of more gross stuff by the Daevites, SCP-4140, another 140,
Sarkic Containment Procedures,
which is such a clever title. Sarkic Containment Procedures, SCP, by Hatch-Eye. Now, this is mostly a Sarkic focused article.
Well, how did it end up in the list? That's strange.
Because the overlap between Sarkicism, at least from their early history, and the Daevites are incredibly intimately connected.
I can't wait for the next episode, which will be on Alagata, and we'll have nothing to do. Oh wait, you're just going to go through the list of everything that's vaguely connected to Sarkicism, and just
everything is Sarkicism. It's that simple. Listen,
it's the interconnecting meat thread that runs through the whole wiki now.
Praise Ion. Anyway. So this is a cave.
Hallowed be however his name is pronounced.
That's right. Eon, Ion, Oon, Yon. Actually,
I'm gonna go with Yon.
To be honest,
a lot of the readers in
it's Proto-Uralic. It probably is Yon. Anyway,
I don't think you want to go with Yon, considering how some people feel about Sarkicism.
Yeah.
I said some people. I didn't say me. I'm here.
I know.
I'm listening. Tell me about the Sarkic Containment Procedures, Grigori.
So, this is a cave, but at the center of the cave is a portal to another universe. And the cave is entirely made up of, it was originally an actual, stone cave or rock cave, like any cave would be. But now it's all entirely covered in consisting of organic material. And it turns out that this cave was slowly taken over by the body of a Karcist, a spiritual leader in Sarkicism.
Talk about a man cave. Wah, wah.
Jesus Christ.
It just occurred to me. I didn't even have that one in my pocket. This is just how clever I am at 12:16 in the morning.
Man,
carry on.
He literally uses his body, growing himself into the structure of the cave, to seal the portal, because the portal was being used by Daevite priestesses to sacrifice slaves. He thought to feed their deaths to an entity beyond, which is a Daevite god. And it's not clearly stated, but it is one of the sources for the concepts that the Daevites worship Yada Baoth.
And you got it.
I spelled it right. And the Archons, which is its servant god things. It's not explicitly made clear, but it's sort of one of those things that is between the lines and much of the lore between the Sarkics and the Daevites, that the greatest adversary of the Sarkics in terms of their religion was what the Daevites worshipped. Now, who's to say that's true? This article does a really good job of cementing how important and vital it was for the Sarkics in the beginning to resist and overcome the Daevas, because here's a guy who has, spent a lot of time making himself powerful, making himself a leader of people. And he sacrifices his life to become this permanent containment vessel for this horrible yawning, mouth into oblivion. And what's really interesting is that the people that spend too much time in the cave go through a series of mental and then physical changes, which, just to quickly summarize, turns them into what seems to me like good Sarkic soldiers. They can transform their bodies. They're very dedicated to making sure this process stays there. Part of the process is this specific music being played, which has been played by some surviving descendants of his followers for centuries, to help essentially continue to contain this portal but also keeping him from growing further, because he seems to be almost turned himself into cancer, because he's constantly recreating cells of his own body, and he's not animate anymore. He's no longer conscious. But it's really interesting because it ends with not too long of a segment of his actual journals, and I just thought I would read the end of it because I thought it was pretty moving. The words recorded here will be my last coherent memories. I reject the Daeva sacrifice of the many for the few, just as I reject the inherent cruelty of life. The true nature of the demiurge, or Yada Baoth, lives within us all. Defiance of this nature has always been the only road to kindness. If I must live forever in the dark so that all others may see the glorious light of Ikunan, or the Sarkic paradise, their heaven, then so be it. And
good stuff.
Not only is it good stuff, it's kind of a play on we die in the dark so you can live in the light.
It is.
And this is
absolutely
Sarkic containment procedures. This article is wonderful.
It is.
I'm biased because I like all Sarkic things, but it's just such a smart, because it seems like, it's another creepy body horror thing. No, actually,
And in addition to that, since you read part of the end, I'm going to read a little bit of the beginning, just because it's called Sarkic containment procedures. A lot of people hate writing the conprocs, the containment procedures, because they think, it's just an irritant that's in the way of telling your story. Our friend Ip absolutely despises writing containment procedures and often forgets to do them.
He just posted one and he almost forgot to do it.
Yes, for our context. That's right. That's how much he doesn't like, and we didn't even notice because we're terrible. But anyway, I feel that because they are the first thing that shows up that is something that you have written yourself as opposed to a number or an object class, the first thing they see, other than maybe a picture, is the containment procedures. They should function as your hook. Mm-hmm. You should write something in there that makes the reader go, what the fuck could this possibly be that you need to do that to keep it where it is? And that's what I think the power of that thing is it makes the reader have an opportunity to see how weird this must be and want to find out more. And there's a protocol described in the containment procedures that I just want to read because I think it's a kick-ass hook.
Yeah.
To prevent the manifestation of additional volumes of SCP-4140-2, music must be played in the central cave chamber at all times. The musicians must be seated in a circle surrounding SCP-4140. These musicians should be proficient with at least one string or woodwind instrument, but the specific melody played is not relevant to containment. A provisional underground site with temporary living quarters for containment personnel should be maintained. A total of 15 musicians are to be kept on site, with an additional set of musicians housed on the surface for bi-weekly rotation. This ensemble of musicians is designated Tau 8, Zan's violinists. Additional Foundation staff must be present to monitor Tau 8's shifts and to watch for obsessive and irrational behavior indicative of SCP-4140-induced mania. Deceased members of Tau 8 should be allowed to continue playing until the smell of decomposition becomes disruptive to other members. What?
So good.
Like, that's a hook.
Yeah,
that is a hook. That's a good hook.
Yeah, I agree with you. For in terms of the Conprox being a good hook in general, and there's a couple, and to get back into creative court a little bit of advice for people that want to write articles, I often have looked at Conprox as kind of the last thing I do because they're not as important. But that doesn't mean that you can't still kind of think about what could I include in here that makes sense with my grander narrative, with my weird, whatever my anomaly is, but that will also pique the interest of. If it's just as simplistic, it needs to be submerged in blah, 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 then it probably won't work that way. But you could go, in this way, it's usually a very effective way to say something kind of ridiculous or outlandish in there.
Yeah.
But it could also be something that's much more subtle and just feels completely out of place. For example, in 5923, I basically focused on the fact that the Foundation needs to get seriously invested in the tourism board in Turkey, but didn't explain. Because I wanted people...
That's the beauty of it.
And then I don't explain it in the article either. All I say at the very end is, and Conprox were, updated accordingly.
Yeah, and you read the article, you will understand why. But it's enough to make you go like, huh. Like the one I wrote that I'm the proudest of is only one sentence, and it's actually the entire Conprox are only one sentence, and it is... In the unlikely event that SCP-54016 still exists, its recontainment will not become necessary for approximately 5 billion years. I killed Grigori.
I just remember which one you were talking about.
It's enough to make the reader go, pardon? And if you can make them go, pardon, which is the invitation from themselves to learn more at the beginning, why would you not do that?
Yeah, a good hook is always useful, no matter what it is. I mean, think back to your high school essays and how often you would open with a quote that now I would suggest people not do in any sort of intellectual exercise. But it did happen a lot when I was writing essays about the Scarlet Letter or whatever.
Yes, or you could start with a dictionary definition, which is what I would call an anti-hook. Makes me instantly not want to read what you're writing. But anyway, now we're sounding like really old people, so maybe we should go to the next SCP.
Young people have to write essays.
Yes, but we sound like we're grading their essays, because that's actually where I'm coming from.
Well, you're a teacher, I'm not. Anyway, so, different SCP. This one's a little bit more modern. SCP-5280 Honeymandeus, which is a very funny title, by Amelia Wright and Stormbreath. Stormbreath, who also was involved in writing 6140, which we'll talk about later. So that's two.
Yes.
He's one of the few. So they are one of the few people on this list that are on it twice, except for myself.
Except for Grigori, who's on here like 3 times.
And this is a species of honeybee adapted by the Daevas to survive colder weather. And if it stopped there, it'd be the most boring article ever. But it doesn't, because they produce much larger hives with advanced architecture. And if that doesn't make you go, wait, what? What?
Yes.
Wait, they make skyscrapers? Kind of. So they make their beehives to resemble Daevite temples or other culturally significant buildings. And not only that, they will often manipulate hedges or bushes to recreate famous scenes in Daevite history. What's fascinating...
As bees generally do not do.
Not normally, but, if you ask them nicely.
Yeah.
That's right.
Just a little bit of bee speak for all you bee phones. I guess it would be apiophones, but I go with the colloquial term. Can you hurry up and say something sensible so I can stop?
No, one of these days I'm just going to stop and just let you just kind of keep rambling. And then it's just going to be the whole episode is going to be great.
And that'll be my last day in the community.
What's cool about this one is, much like other articles we've talked about in different episodes, where it's a later article that provides a lens to look back on earlier stuff, these bees are now made to be, in the universe, essential to the maintaining of these anomalous plants that the Daeva make, because the only way to pollinate these plants, because, reminder, the Daevites survive, the Empire sprang out of being in central Siberia, a place that is not known for, incredibly tolerant plant life, it's a fairly cold environment. And these bees are the only ways to pollinate these anomalous Daevite plants. And they're the ones that are able to, maintain specifically the, longevity of these weird plants. So then that kind of adds in another layer to all these other articles and say, okay, well, was there, a colony of these bees nearby or something? Is the Foundation intent? It's just I just find it really interesting.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, the article cites to SCP-140 with a textual excerpt. The little priestesses, or the bees, were of course crucial to the maintenance of the Empire. Without them, so much of our great works would not have been possible. Our gardens were not like the rest of the world. They produce our weapons and armies. And who tends to the gardens but the little priestesses?
Mm-hmm.
So it's these cute, little bees that make scale models of stuff out of their hives, but also they're part of arms proliferation.
Yep. They build arms and architecture. They're the ultimate invasive species. There's this implication there's this implication. It's not even an implication. It's a statement that when they go to colonize a new space, the bees are there first, setting the place up for them. We know we're going to live here now because the bees are out.
What's interesting is it's found and discovered in a modern, somewhat modern. I think it's back in the 40s or something. Place called Glendale in the UK, where a small family-run farm is still maintaining a colony of these bees, and at the end they transplant some of the bees to a site to be studied, but they keep them there for historical respect, which seems very understanding for the Foundation, in my opinion.
It does, and almost suspiciously so.
It feels more reflective of how cool of people Amelia Wright and Stormbreath are.
Yes.
But they're we should respect people's livelihoods.
I also like the fact that there's a notation in here that it's 140A who's the one who brought these bees to this weird house, and there appear to have been normal people hanging out here, and it says something to the effect of, if he was hanging out with people, that seems to be a bit of a stretch from what he usually does, and there's some implications here that the fellow or lady is getting, or whatever, is getting fed up with the long wait to bring the Daevas back and is getting a little lonely.
Interestingly, and this is not quote-unquote canon, but when I was talking to Assertive Roland, he talked about the fact that 140A was not really the person that was obsessed with bringing the Daeva back, but was a survivor of the Daevite culture and was desperate to try and give them another chance for them to finally learn how to be a better people, but it just keeps repeating the same mistake. It's like a sunken cost fallacy thing.
That's good, and that's actually implied in this article.
Yeah.
So they were definitely vibing on the same level there.
And it's just, what an interesting, because my first thought when reading 140 is well, who is this crazy person who's going around spreading this blood book that is bringing the creeping, crawling chaos out of the history to come and get us? Well, no, he's just sentimental and really, really wishes that his culture would learn to stop being assholes. Retroactively.
Someday there will be an American doing this.
Yes. And then we have an article from Hammer Maiden, who has shown up in many of these lists because she is incredibly talented. And this one is pretty recent as well, SCP-5711, which is a terrific article. And all these have been, but man, this article's nuts. Called Threat Level Midnight.
No, I ever heard that before.
I don't know where.
Oh, you don't know. Well, we'll keep going. We'll just leave it as an inside joke for people who do know. Carry on.
That's up. All right. SCP-5711 is a thaumaturgic ritual capable of altering the course of historical events, very Daevite, without direct intervention by traditional temporal displacement methodology. Recovered materials from SCP-5711-1 suggest that the ritual and the apparatus involved in its completion were developed by the Daevite civilization in 250 BC. Mm-hmm. And this is part of Hammer Maiden's amazing time travel series, which is the Temporal Anomalies Department. That's not the name of the series, but it's the stuff that it stars Thaddeus How do you pronounce his last name?
I usually say Zhank.
Zhank. Oh, well, that's much better than X-Tank or whatever I was going to say.
X-Tank. Thaddeus X-Tank. Thaddeus X-Con.
Professor X-Tank.
I think it's probably Zyank or Zhank or something along those lines, but we'd have to ask someone who actually knows.
That's true. We do know her, so we should ask her.
We should ask her.
And what's cool about this one is that it is a modern Daevite cult that has converted members of Sarkism and members of Church of the Broken God and been like, aren't you sick of the way that your religion has not brought you closer to like fulfillment or whatever? It somehow has convinced them to join in with him so that he can like recreate it's kind of hard to say what the ultimate goal was, but it's implied it was for like the invigoration of the Daevite Empire.
As usual.
Right. And I would say, other than our stolen history, our stolen future, our stolen theory. Shit, I forget what that article is named. This is one of the coolest timey-wimey sort of articles on the wiki.
Yes, because that's one of the things that Hammer Maiden absolutely excels at.
Right, absolutely. Because, and I forget the agent's name in the article, but basically what we see is the Foundation going to explore, to investigate, because this ritual was quote-unquote successful, but the result was not what was predicted, and it turns into this like bubble of like entropy / time warp, whatever. There's a great picture in the article that like just shows like this dome of blackness over the mountains.
It's an amazing picture.
It really works because it really looks like, oh shit, that should not be there.
It's such an amazing picture that the agents in the story actually lampshade the fact that the picture is pants shitting, and the reader does not disagree.
Yeah, like I mean, it's clearly an edited image, but like the idea of like, here's this like serene vista of the mountains, and look, there's a period of unreality. There's just a dome of blackness.
Here comes nothing.
And basically, when they're exploring it, I don't want to give too much away because it's just kind of a roller coaster ride, but when they're exploring it, they not only run into members of their own team that are already there or have died.
Yes.
And one of them who has died more than once.
Yes.
Because, it's like this little pocket of, temporal reality where things are repeating over and over again, but it's not just repeating, it's like almost like a video game. It keeps giving this one agent another chance to like solve the problem. And, everyone should just go read it because everything Hammer Maiden writes is awesome. I know she's mostly known, at least in the offsite community, as the author of SCP-2000, which is a landmark article, but the stuff about the Temporal Anomalies Department is nuts and phenomenal.
Absolutely.
And this
absolutely
does such a good like retroactive like world building with the Daevites, even though that's not really the point of the article.
Yeah.
And yet again, we're dealing with retrocausal anomalies, which is one of the three tenets of the Daevites. Essentially, it's horticulture, retrocausality, and fucking blood worshipping.
Yep.
So SCP-6140, which is the True Empire, again by
one of our many enemies that came out of absolutely fucking nowhere and beat the shit out of us in 6Con.
Look, we wrote 95,000 words. The fact that it is not at +2 is amazing.
Yeah, like, I can't complain. And I don't mean like I am secretly complaining and I'm pretending. I just can't complain because I had this image of us crashing and burning because we posted 50,000 words and then added 48,000 more or whatever. But it didn't. It did really well. I have no complaints.
Yeah, I mean, I remember conversations before we ever posted anything where I was like very strenuously suggesting, listen, we each got to try. This is going to be so long. We each got to try to keep everything under 5,000 words because at the end of this, if this is a 30,000 word article, that's a lot, but it's not like incomparably huge. Like, there are other articles that Harry has written that are already in that ballpark. That seems reasonable.
And then it turned out absolutely none of us who went back to our little lonely writers' rooms actually made any effort whatsoever to try and keep it down.
That's not true. I cut whole scenes.
I cut a whole... Okay, we'll be completely honest. You, Ip, and I cut our stuff back, and Dark Stuff didn't. But anyway...
Well,
anyway, we're not talking about...
That's okay. I like his path better than almost anything I wrote for it.
Yeah, well, I think most people like his path the best out of the initial bunch.
So anyway. Good. Anyway, so 6140...
But we're not talking about 6500. We're talking about the thing that beat us. This got, what, 4th place or something like that?
I think so, yeah. And this is very intentionally... subverting the expectations in a 180 turn from everything we have learned about the Daevites up until now, which is just fucking cool. So the anomaly at play in this article is the actual Daevite Empire. And a cult, which is dedicated to the Scarlet King. So, yet again, this is another version of the Daevites who, according to these authors, the Daevites were dedicated to the Scarlet King. Stole copies of SCP-140, and in the process of doing a ritual to try and bring about the return of the Daevite Empire, destroy all the copies of SCP-140. And their ritual is successful. But it has a delayed effect. And so it's going to be like a year or something like that to the next summer equinox. I forget exactly the time frame, but the point is the Foundation is in the know that this is going to happen. We are going to see a return of the Daevite Empire. And it's going to be a retrocausal return, meaning that their entire history will have been changed such that they are still in existence as of today. Meaning we are going to have to worry about modern day weapons and the advancements in their techniques that have taken place over the last few thousand years since they got destroyed. And here's the entire piece of geography that we can expect them to control, and we have to start thinking about how we're going to fight them back, and we will not allow normalcy to be destroyed. We will not go into that good night quietly. We're going to take all of our really important Foundation researchers and staff, and we're going to put them in these reality-anchored bunkers to protect from the causality wave, and we're going to come out of this swinging. It's like this whole big speech by 05-1.
Yeah, it's great because it's like, oh, this is the reality we knew was going to happen as soon as we read 140, and you're reading the article like, this is it. They're going to show up. This is going to be the end. This is the thing we were basically inherently promised by 140 is the really bad thing is about to happen, and the article handles that exactly as you would imagine. It's framed as this gigantic, holy shit, get your bug out bag. This is about to go really south really fast, and it's exactly what you would expect for this because this is obviously about to be a gigantic fucking disaster. Yeah.
051, we will survive the reappearance of the Daevite Empire. Regardless of what happens on March 20th, normalcy will be protected. The consensus will be maintained. And it's a list pages article, meaning...
Yep, which means it's got multiple iterations.
And at the end, you say, alert. I don't remember the exact quote. But alert, the reality shift in progress. And that's a link, and you click it, and the article switches, and it turns out the Daevite Empire did get reestablished. But, as all countries and all cultures do, time and the progress of history has led to every long-lasting civilization slowly becoming, in pace with the rest of modernity. And that didn't not happen to the Daevites. They also followed the path of history. That's not to say that every modern country is progressive or something, but most modern day world powers aren't going around taking slaves these days.
Right, the Daeva came back and they are a country in Asia.
That's right. It's the Daevestan. It's just Daevestan.
Yeah. It's like the Republic of Daevestan or something like that. It's like, they're here.
And it abandons its heinous ways centuries ago, like so many countries did over the years. And like most nations, have slowly but surely brought themselves to modern understanding of civil and human rights. Here's a quote. It is now known that SCP-140 was highly inaccurate. Further, it was discovered that the former prevailing theory as to the operation of SCP-140, that it was restoring an ontologically annihilated civilization into being, was only partially correct. It was also the phenomenon that initially ontologically annihilated Daevite history. The complete destruction of all copies of SCP-140 undid its effects and ontologically reinstated SCP-6140-A, which is modern day actual real life Daevastan to its original form. Because it turns out that SCP-140A, at least in this version, is just some dude in 1700s Britain who visited the Daeva and like read through their histories and became sort of enamored with their old barbarous ways, and like all colonial white people thought that he could tell a more interesting history than they're actually people who lived there and were part of the culture. And he decides to write this book, which is a chronicle of the Daeva. Only he takes the book, which is SCP-140, ignored most of the country's history and blended its popular mythology into the nation's history. So, like, the concepts of, like, George Washington and, like, Abraham Lincoln and, like, Babe the Blue Ox and, like, shit like that, that's part of American bullshit popular mythology, he took that stuff and was like, that's actually history, yo. Only he got an occultist to do some kind of crazy ritual that made it so that the Daevas were wiped out, so that reality was completely changed, where the only existing history was his horrible book. So he's like the worst example of like a colonial anthropologist.
Yeah, like the Daevas, the slave-owning, cannibalistic, occasionally Daevas, were wiped out ages ago by their slaves who took over and made a perfectly good country. And yet what this guy did in writing his ridiculous history was he concretized them at their worst moment and pretended they were that way forever, which explains why they're stagnant, why they're exactly the same whenever they get moved ahead in the timeline.
Right.
Because he's made this version of them that is just a cartoon version of them, and that's the version we all believe. That's the version that the wiki is based on. And there's just this big table of, so here's what everybody thought the Daeva were like. Turns out, not really, for most of history. That's actually bullshit. It just goes through. Because it's this Orientalist guy creating this other version of them, and it's not like that at all, and they're kind of horrified to read the version of history that we all believe they belong to.
Yeah, it's like the white weeb nerd who's like obsessed with samurais and like wrote a book entirely on like samurai culture, and then decided to portray all of Japanese history to be samurai culture or whatever, and it's just like, yo, that's not real. Like, you don't get to tell people what history was. You're not even from there. And what's really fun is it ends with like a presentation in the kind of the old style of the SCP orientation tale, factored into this article, where a modern day Daevastani Foundation researcher is giving a presentation to these other like emerging Foundation members who are all in these reality anchored bunkers, so they have not been part of reality shifting back, and so they have to like come to grips with modern reality that, hey, the Daevites, they were real and it's crazy, and it's just a place. It's a place.
It's beautiful
with people, and you're right. Back in the day, they were the worst slave-owning, civilization that's ever existed. But, like, eventually that caught up to them, and we've been pretty chill ever since.
It's beautiful, the ending of it, because it's essentially an Orientalized people's demand to the Orientalizers to stop it. Because the reality-anchored Foundation people are coming with their remembrance of the bad version of the Daeva, and this Daeva person is like, I know what you guys are thinking. Even though your job is to maintain consensus normalcy, I know what you're thinking, and what you're thinking is, how can we return everything to the version that we remember because we are right? And what I'm telling you is that your version was never right, and don't you dare try to erase us.
Yeah, the only reason that was quote-unquote normal was because some other asshole decided to impose his worldview on us, and I'm even a member of the Foundation, so just calm your shit. Just calm down.
Right, it's time that your version of our history stopped overwriting what happened.
Yeah, it's so good. And
it's a great article. It's not in my headcanon at all.
No.
It's a great article.
No, I mean, in, most of my dedicated...
Because it wipes out everything.
Yeah, it's one of the best ways of taking a very old idea for a modern day, especially for a big, splashy contest, like a 1,000 contest.
Yeah.
And,
that's what they do.
Yeah,
they reimagine
exactly.
things. They do things that aren't in continuity with anything else, that are just like crazy out there ideas, because that's when you can do something like that.
Get away with writing a novel on the wiki.
Exactly.
Not that this one was a novel. It's actually...
Except our novel is in canon. But anyway.
That's true. Although I made some pretty big changes there at the end.
Yeah, you made some pretty big changes, but I killed Bright and 173.
Yeah, sure did. All dead.
Yeah, dead.
So we're going to briefly talk about the Trash Fire, which is this brilliant canon by Uranium Empire and a lot of others. But Uranium Empire is sort of one of the primary motivating factors here. Obviously, it's a canon, so they could not have been the only author. But the only reason we're going to briefly do it is because A, it's dense. There's a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of articles attached to it. And B, it deserves its own episode. It's brilliant. I haven't read everything, but the ones I have read are just, they are on a whole nother level than compared to stuff on the wiki. Compared to my stuff on the wiki, I feel like it's just on a whole nother level. It's brilliant. But just wanted to read this bit from the hub, which is kind of setting up the worldview of the Trash Fire. And the Trash Fire primarily follows the fallout caused by the quote-unquote old gods, and very specifically the four worshipped in the Daevite Empire. The Verdant Mage, a vast and mindless entity of fire and poison. This sounds like something out of Elden Ring.
You're going to say, it sounds like my ex-wife or something.
No, I don't. No, I would not say that. The Scarlet King, the aquatic eunuch, lord of violence and hierarchy. I don't know why aquatic. The Violet Queen, a screeching horror associated with glittering corruption, usurpation, and insects. That
I could have just kept making the ex-wife joke this whole time.
Yeah, they all could slip. Yeah.
I let it slip right between my fingers.
That which makes holes in the shape of worms, a vicious anti-meme known throughout negative space. Which,
God, that's a good name.
If I'm wrong, somebody correct me, but it feels like it's a reference to there is no Animatics division.
I can never remember his number, but I feel like it's
yeah.
We could be completely wrong, but I know what you're thinking.
If it's not, I think it's meant to be evocative of it.
Yeah.
The Daevites, and by extension the old gods, were opposed by the Imit, a culture of clay humanoids ingrained with knowledge of thaumaturgy by their foremost slave masters, Homo sapiens descensus. What started as Daevite expansion into Imit territory turned into an existential battle that nearly exterminated the Imit, yet irreparably damaged the influence of the old gods on Earth. All of this found its way into the modern world. Communities formed around the ossified bones of dead horrors, descendants of their brutality integrated into their neighbors, and all in all, life just seemed to go on as absurdly and chaotically as it always felt. And then the Foundation gets involved, which, as we all know, always goes for the better.
Yes, of course.
And honestly, if you heard me read that portion and are not immediately impressed by sort of, it starts off with this big, grandiose world building, feels like someone's talking about, Dark Souls or Elden Ring or something. And yet the individual articles, some of them are brilliant, big scope, world, mind-bendy weirdness. But almost all of them are also incredibly grounded, and it's just Uranium Empire is just on a whole other level, in my opinion.
Absolutely,
and I'm fairly jealous.
You're not alone in that opinion. Yeah. That's a fairly commonly held opinion.
Although I feel like Offsite, not kind of unknown. And
which is unfortunate. It happens a lot.
It does, and I think like Famine Bulls, I think people should just go if you take anything from this. Go and read the Trash Fire.
Yeah, go read some UE.
And then another, although a smaller tale series by Djoric called Empire of Dirt. And this is another example of the Daeva where they were centered and around a city of Davon. And it's a 3-part tale series, although there is actually kind of a shadow 4th part. And it's really good reading, like everything Djoric does. Really good character-based stuff. Interestingly enough, this is another deviation where the Daevites worship the Scarlet King.
Yes.
Which, depending on your headcanon, doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I like that all these different versions exist, basically.
Yes.
And then, I don't know, who is this guy who writes weird Greek letters? Hecatoncheires? Weird. Grigori Karpin, what a nerd.
Yeah, I don't know about this. I see this is at the end of the outline. I think maybe we should just skip
cut it. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to talk about it very much, but
we could spend a whole thing on Half the Conquerors, but I would have to make you do it. I
don't.
mean, you would want to do it, but it would have to be my fault, or you would feel bad. But anyway,
you'd have to like interview me or something about it.
Yes,
but and it's also not finished, so it'd be crazy. But basically, as I mentioned before, in my first article, which was the first article of my series, SCP-4612, I mention
not all gods decompose.
Thank you, man. I do like that title a lot.
It's a great title.
The mention of the Daevites is in connection with this dead slug god, which was not dead at the time, having something to do with the downfall of the Daeva, as opposed to what was commonly understood from SCP-140. Mm-hmm. And I just threw that in there for like color and for like tone setting, to basically be like, oh, look how crazy this in history this dead slug god had involved himself. But eventually it became kind of imperative to me to like pay that off. And
yes,
about halfway through, about a third of the way through, I started introducing more and more Daevites to the articles, and it basically turns into like an entire, not a return of the entire Daevite empire, but like a specific matriarch who was like preserved, essentially, is like potentially undead. It's unclear because I haven't totally explained any of it. Who is kind of running around Russia and other parts of previously controlled Daevite territory, trying to A, get revenge, and B, reestablish a foothold in the modern day world. Doing such things as like necromancy, bringing about interesting golems, but also funding and controlling a energy company in Russia. Because she's
one of these things is not like the other.
She's trying to like a big, wide scope. You cast a wide net when you're trying to retake over the world.
Absolutely. And
a couple of the ones that really focus on it, although she and the other Daevites are kind of like relatively important to that storyline, is 5627, which is Golems of the Eastern Slope, and 5626. No, I think I got those numbers wrong. They're not right next to each other.
That would be weird. Why would they both be?
They are not right next to each other.
I was thinking that too. That's not right.
It must be wrong. I don't know. Internet.
It would be particularly funny if if the second one was one number below the first one.
Yeah, that would be. That can't be right.
Grigori counts backwards when he does the Daeva. It's the retro causality thing, right?
No, it's 5267. So that's my fault.
There you go.
So Golems of the Eastern Slope is 5267.
And it's also Golems of the Eastern Steppe.
Sorry.
I mean, you don't know. You don't know this article very well. It's written by Grigori Karpin. You haven't read a lot by him.
People are always saying he's a good author, and then they're kind of like, I'll put it off. I'll wait to read his stuff.
Yeah, you're always saying how much you like Grigori's stuff, but do you ever read it, man? Jeez.
Oh, it's such a meta joke. All right. And then the Far Shore, which is 5626, which are both related to sort of Daevite thaumaturgical weirdness.
Great articles.
Thank you. I really like Golems of the Eastern Slope. I really like some of the pictures I did for that as well.
Yeah, it's great.
And then, finally, just because, we've been kind of pacing around it a little bit, and we mentioned in the previous episode, a few months back, I decided to make a Daevite hub.
Yeah.
And I just thought I'd read something from the author post because it kind of explains my thought process. I was doing research for a new article, which turned into In the Carpathians, which I co-wrote with Pentagon. And I decided to read through all the SCPs that had the Daevite tag. And unfortunately, the vast majority of these articles only mention the Daeva in a passing fashion, as I mentioned earlier in this episode. So they wanted to create a historical note for an unrelated anomaly that they want to establish, hey, see, this thing is really important to history. And yet, it didn't have, most of the articles would not have much relating to the actual Daeva, as opposed to the ones we talked about today.
Yeah.
And so I thought, as I am in this position where I am trying to find out more about the Daeva so I can write this article that involves their anomalies, I thought, well, God, how useful would it be if there was a hub? Because so many, it is a group of interest, but it's the only one, I think, the only well-established one that seems to have no hub. Why is that? And probably, I assume, and I even got some crit from some very not smart crit, in my opinion, being like, well, who are you to write this? I'm me.
That's not how that works.
I'm me, and I'm going to write it. That's why. Did you like it or not? That's all I wanted to hear about.
I'm the person who's going to put the work in. That's who. Who are you?
Right. And, it was interesting because, as we've been talking about, all these articles are really intriguing, and they all have centralized concepts, but there really didn't feel like one picture of what Daevite lore is, as opposed to like Sargassism or Church of the Broken God or even Fifthism. There hadn't been a lot of things fleshed out. Like, you couldn't really say who the Daeva were. You could say, oh, well, they seem to be colonial, they seem to be slave takers, they have weird blood sacrifices, but like, that's not really a picture of a culture or some sort of group. Like, what did they want? And so I found like it mostly, as I sat down and wrote all I could from the articles I thought were important, I realized, I'm gonna have to add to this. And so I just started writing. And so like a lot of the stuff on the hub is stuff that I kind of made up whole cloth. And
it fits.
Thanks. I looked at like, some of the practices of Hinduism of telling stories through dance, and thought about how, that was not too far away from the area in which the Daevites were. And so I thought, well, what could the Daevites be interested in dance? And then, okay, they're interested in blood sacrifice, but like more than that, what do we want to say about it? Do I just include a sentence saying they want it? Well, no, let's include like first-hand accounts, maybe excerpts from SCP-140, or maybe a historian who wrote like, a treatise on what their culture was like.
Right.
And so, I hope that the article, the hub, is like helpful for people, but in a lot of weird ways I also feel like slightly like a fraud, because it's like, well, I want to inform people of what the Daevites are, and I kind of redefined them.
But that's how it works. That's the Daeva.
I also want to say
it's very appropriate.
There is a really brilliant article, which we didn't cover here because it's not really a story and it's kind of hard to talk about, called The Old Daevite Language. It's sort of a dossier on breaking down the actual linguistic language of Daeva. And
yes,
it was written by Long Lan Lin, and they also helped me with the hub by taking this language that they, I believe, created whole cloth. It's, Conlang. And did an inscription and some very simplistic like drawings that then I kind of edited and made a little bit more complicated, and then superimposed on rock to make it look like it had been etched into rock, which took a little while, but I think it looks pretty good.
Yeah, that article is really good. I've used it for stuff.
Oh yeah, me too.
Long Lan Ling does conlang stuff, constructed language stuff, and in fact, if you say anything involving the words constructed language in the SCP declassified Discord, it used to just summon long language. Might still, I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, I tried to write it, in undergrad, I studied anthropology, and so, like, I, tried to write it not as an academic paper, but from this perspective of, like, okay, well, who were the Daeva? These are historians that are writing, or anthropologists who are writing about this people that no longer exist, that have this, very heady sort of baggage with all these different issues with SCP-140 and all these different versions of them out there. And so trying to balance the mystery with trying to also flesh them out as like a real people. Not sympathetic, because at their core they are pretty awful. But I did think it was interesting to try and talk about them as like an actual culture, or at least try to, and hopefully it was successful. I don't know.
It absolutely was. Actually, on that note, I just want to call back again to Empire of Dirt by Jorok, because there's a few really great vignettes of the ancient Daeva people that are really great for world building, and that 4-part series is really, really good.
Yes.
It's really, 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 really good.
Yeah. it's like a constrained narrative. Like it's got kind of a beginning and middle and end, and so it's why I didn't want to go into it that much here, and why I don't like go into tremendous detail on the hub, because it's just like, listen, if you are interested in the Daeva, just go read them. They're fairly short, but they are brilliant.
Yeah, I think that should be our one this time for, besides also the Trash Fire. That should be the one where we go read Empire of Dirt. They're not long, and they're great.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so emails. If anyone wants to send us an email, you don't have to send it just about the current episode. It could just be about anything SCP related or creative or about writing or just questions. Who cares? Anything.
Just some insults.
Who's your favorite Pokemon? I don't know. I don't play Pokemon, but if you like Pokemon,
Omastar.
What are you saying? What'd you say?
I didn't say anything.
Yes, you did. Oh, you're the worst. This is so awkward. It's not even funny. I'm going to cut all this. Anyway. All right. So our email here is simplycreativepeople@gmail.com.
I can't wait. Here it comes. Here it comes. Can you do it?
What?
Come on. You did the first Twitter. Now read the second one.
That was an email, and now I'm going to read the emails.
Oh, I thought you were going to do the Twitter thing where you
Shut
you sound like where you say your name like it's the first time you've ever heard it. Oh,
reading the letters out of your name is weird. Anyway, especially a name you made up 2 years ago. So we got one email.
Your name isn't actually Grigori Karpin.
Oh no! I've doxed myself. That's right. Just guess what it is, and you'll find me. So,
all right, I'm done stalling. Read the emails.
So our first email is from Boris. Honestly, discussing the Daeva. It's another group I know almost nothing about, which is weird because I love both the articles I do know, which is 140 and 6140. I noticed they really love that 140 ending. Oh, I know, the numeric. Yeah. Like we said earlier, like the calling back to 140 is kind of a fun trope in these articles. And especially fun because it's all, like I said, different authors that are like, oh, I want to tie it into that core concept.
Yep.
Gori, who was nice enough to introduce me to Assertive Roland, thank you. Ever since reading the Parawatch Tale by Grigori, which is in the Carpathians, I've been on a binge of Daevite articles, my faves being 4008, Wormwood, and 6140, The True Empire. Both great articles. So I have high hopes for this episode. This paragraph only exists to brag about how I organized an online meeting between Assertive Roland and Grigori. And to close this off, there is no ethical consumption under cannibalism.
Damn right.
Good job, Corey.
Beautiful.
And I just want to say thank you to Assertive Roland. I'm sure he's not listening, but we did talk for like several hours about his concepts, about where the Daeva originally were, and I plan to factor that into future articles.
Beautiful.
All right. So here's the part you were making fun of me for. So our Twitters are for the show is @SIMCREAT. My personal Twitter is @GRIGORIKARPIN.
I guess mine is @HARRYBLANKSCP. See how natural that sounded? I bet you I missed a letter, but I'm not going to think about it.
It sounded about as natural as all these Daevite puns.
Oh, that's cruel.
But is it cold?
Oh, good callback.
All right, bye.
You absolutely slew me, man. Everybody's dead, Daeva.
Oh God.
Daeva, you fool.
Any more?
I'll keep them to myself. They could be my own personal treasures. Goodbye.
Goodbye.